Welcome. This is the Drupal usability meeting for May 21st, 2021. I'm Benji Fisher, sharing my screen. And also on the meeting are Anmol Goel, Christina Chunias, and Thomas Howell. Thank you all for coming. And as usual, we have a group of people with diverse backgrounds. I think site builder, backend developer. Christina, would you say you're a designer or front-end developer or both?
Both.
Okay, and Anmol, how do you describe your role in Drupal? You're still muted. But anyway, we all have an interest in usability, but no one is a certified usability expert, but we benefit from having diverse backgrounds. We've been talking about this issue, 3059984, add a new content editor role to the standard profile. And just in the last few weeks, we've agreed to move it to reviewed and tested by community. So it's possible that will be committed soon and be part of Drupal 9.3, which is a big step forward. It's something we've been talking about for a while. But there is a technical issue with this. One of the things this does is add several permissions to the new role, the content editor role. It adds several permissions that are related to content moderation using certain editorial transitions. Now, in the standard profile, the workflows and the content moderation modules are not enabled. So that's okay. We grant those permissions, and should the site administrator later enable those modules, those permissions take effect. However, there's another issue I've been following, 2571235. And in fact, I've been reviewing it, and Alex Pott has been doing a lot of work on it in response to my reviews and otherwise. And the title is Roles Should Depend on Objects That Are Building the Granted Permissions. And what this means in particular is that once this issue gets committed, we will no longer have that option of assigning permissions to a role if those permissions are not provided by an enabled module. So this becomes a problem with the new content editor role, since it has permissions from the content moderation module. This issue is going to take away the option of letting those permissions hang around until the module is enabled. So I've been thinking about how we can reconcile these two issues, which I think are both likely to be committed for Drupal 9.3. So one option is to add an additional role that will depend on the content moderation module. That would be less disruptive, but it's sort of clutter with a bunch of roles. And just today, while I was in the shower, it occurred to me that maybe we should be thinking bigger, that a way to avoid these problems is not to add the content editor role to the standard profile, but to create a brand new profile that has the new content editor and the content manager roles, and perhaps other good stuff. So any reactions so far? Any questions? You are all muted.
So basically we'll be adding a new profile?
That is my suggestion.
But apart from having these specific roles, what will be the, the benefit from it?
So one thing it would do, say we call it a publishing profile. Currently, when you install Drupal, you have these three choices. Standard, which is what everyone uses in practice. Minimal, which I guess some advanced users will use for some use cases. And the Umami demo profile, which is explicitly labeled experimental, and you're explicitly warned, oh, I guess that warning went away. But anyway, when you install it, you're explicitly warned that you shouldn't use it for real sites. That's not a lot of choices. So it would give us a real choice in core, say a publishing profile. Then we could take a lot of the work that's been done on Umami and move it into this new publishing profile and have it something that people could actually use on real sites without being discouraged. And then I don't know, what else could we add to it? I have one idea I'm prepared to suggest, but it sort of opens up possibilities that when you're thinking in terms of an entirely new profile rather than just a new role. Tell me, what would you like to see in a new publishing profile? I guess for starters, we would enable content moderation. Anything else?
It would take me some significant thought to answer that accurately. I'm also wondering about, so I think I probably have not asked a question that I should have a long time ago, which was, when we are talking about these new roles, the expectation has always been that they would only be introduced for net new build sites. Is that a correct assumption now?
Yes, when you add a role to the standard profile, that has no effect on existing sites. Existing sites own their configuration. A
Yep.
role is part of configuration. It only matters when you create a new site using that profile.
And there's no mechanism by which we can easily prepackage and add them or make them loadable. Would that be an additionally correct statement? Because I can't think of any other than like using some of the, I guess, configuration management stuff, but there's no way that we would allow turning that on. So for instance, if you were to enable the content moderation module, it would actually add these roles.
So yes, there is a way. So yeah, that is an alternative. Instead of making the new content editor role part of the standard profile and always there, we could add it in a way so that it only becomes that the entire role is only activated when the content moderation module is enabled. And the standard profile already has some, it's called conditional configuration.
Mm-hmm.
The standard profile already has some conditional configuration that depends on the content moderation module. And that's why as soon as you enable content moderation and workflows, I think content moderation depends on workflows, but I might have it backwards. So as soon as you enable those two modules, you have several workflows available. And
Mm-hmm.
those come from the conditional configuration in the standard profile. You could, in the same way, have a role that is part of the conditional configuration. And that would have the advantage that we'd have a single content editor role. We wouldn't have to split it up into two pieces. It would have the disadvantage that when you enable the standard profile, you would not see that role until and unless you enable content moderation.
Well, we could, in theory, achieve both by adding a profile, because if in the profile we're already assuming that we have to have that enabled, it would be generating the role via enablement. So do you see what I'm saying? Like if rather than using the profile itself to add the configuration, we added the configuration as a result of enabling the module, but we have a content editorial profile, and we were already talking about enabling that module and or others, it would automatically come along and could be written up as part of the description of that, saying like under that installation profile, it would say these are it would include having more robust roles, for instance, but it would give us the option of both enabling it after the fact and encouraging people to start that way from the beginning or get-go.
So you're talking about doing this within a new profile, yes?
So I'm suggesting that it incorporates both your recommendation and the idea, like, but just rather than making it making the configuration part of the profile, make the automatic enablement of what creates the configuration part of that profile. Because you were mentioning that already. You said, what modules do we want to include with that profile? It's just the trigger to get it included comes from the fact that the module's enabled, not just because you picked the profile. That would mean that you could use it after the fact if you so desired, or you could use it, or you could start a site from the beginning and it would be indistinguishable. You wouldn't know, in a positive way.
Okay, so first of all, Aaron McHale has joined us. Welcome.
Hi.
And just to get you caught up quickly, you know we've been talking about adding the new content editor role.
Yep.
I started by mentioning this other issue that I think is likely to be committed in 9.3 that will remove from existing roles any permissions related to modules that are not enabled. So the content editor role we've been discussing has permissions that depend on the content moderation module. And once this other issue is in core, that won't work anymore. You won't be able to have those permissions without enabling content moderation. Got it?
Yep.
So back to Thomas's question, I guess what you're suggesting is instead of putting the new role in the profile where it will only ever be used by new sites, will not be available to existing sites. Instead of doing that, put the role in the content moderation module. And that would work, but only some of the permissions in the new role we've been discussing are related to content moderation. And there are a bunch of other permissions in there that we would like to make easily available. And adding them to the module, yes, the role would suddenly become available as soon as the module is enabled. That's doable. But we also want to make the other permissions available, whether or not content moderation is available.
Got it. I guess I can absolutely defer to your suggestion, but what makes me disappointed in it only being part of the profile because it's something that just didn't click with me until today. So I understand that we've talked about it before. So this may be too 11th hour to discuss. But it would mean that you're talking about a 5 to 7 year time horizon until the vast majority of sites would have these roles, which means that you wouldn't have a training paradigm. You'd be essentially bifurcating how people think about what roles are there or what you could assume was there. And it would mean that backfilling those roles require a significant manual effort on the part of anyone who said, hey, this is a great idea, I want to use this. I mean, there's not going to be a lot of people who are going to just completely rebuild their site on 9. They're going to do updates. They're going to just continue to do updates within band. They would, and so isolating this to a very limited use case is great and awesome in that it means that we have no potential knock-on effects, no unforeseen consequences. So that's a big plus. But on the other hand, it means that we really haven't made a significant UX change for the vast majority of Drupal sites in the world. And we haven't really allowed us to change the thinking of editorial process and how people administer content. So it will take a lot longer. And especially if it's only in this side profile, it means that every site builder has to know up front that they want that kind of experience and they can't even turn it on after they've started. Like if they started with normal, I made the mistake back in the day. I used to always try and start with minimum and it was no fun. Because I used to think, oh, this is the right way to start. And so it's I guess it just behaviorally makes site building more complex without any way to backfill a behavior that we want to be common or would like to at least consider being common.
Aaron, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I've thought about this before, like sites that won't get the content editor role or the content manager role. And to be honest, I'm kind of okay with it because I think, like, I appreciate what Thomas was just saying, but on the other hand, the sites I work with, generally, like, one of the first things you do is you go in and like configure your roles, right? So a lot of existing sites will either like okay, assuming they're not like a one-person operation, which some are. Assume they're, because the sites I work with are, we have a lot of people working on them. So like we'll have content editor roles and content manager kind of roles, and some of them that's like using things like organic groups to have like, or groups to have like roles specific to parts of the site. So I think yeah, from my perspective, I'm not personally too worried about the content editor role or content manager roles not getting into many existing sites. I think most sites, existing sites, at least large ones, have already created those kind of roles.
But I posit that it won't even get into new sites because you have to know from the get-go to use this specialized profile. And standard is going to be the default.
So
we could do both. We could add a content editor role to both profiles, and we'd have to take out the content moderation permissions from the version in standard, but we could include them in the new profile.
So here's a question: Why isn't, like, what? Okay, so what is the point of standard? I mean, why don't we just enable content moderation in standard?
So
Like,
yeah, basically that was going to be my point. So basically standard, its purpose is to not start from scratch, which basically will be from minimal, and to make some assumptions that it would seem that they are shared in an 80% of sites, or that would be useful for an 80% of people, and from there it's just a base that people will built on top of that, but not making hard calls or hard decisions. And I would say probably not specific to one industry, trying to be agnostic on that sense, like it could be useful for almost anybody or something like that. So that's one of the points, or the good points about having the editor role on the standard, was like that's going to be like that something that will help people, because there's going to be something that people will reuse and will start from there. My concern with adding yet another profile, it's not just how to do that, it's more about the bike shedding and all the work that it will carry on. Like, what is going to go in there? Why is going to be just publishing in not another industry or something like that? Who's going to maintain it? I mean, we're not, we don't have that many community investing time. That's, I don't know, that's my basic concern, is adding yet another thing to maintain and to need to discuss and find an agreement. And yeah, I don't know. Those are my thoughts.
Okay, so yeah, a simple
Concerns.
solution. Sorry. So a simple solution to the technical problem would be to add content moderation to the standard profile. Is that going to work?
So from a data perspective, that's dicey, unless you have a way of differentiating the types of content editors. Because if you name the same thing and it has two different sets of permissions, if somebody has, it's just it ends up being a challenge from an enterprise perspective. So this may not matter to anyone who's building a site for an individual company. But from a larger scale maintenance perspective, it's really never a great idea to call the same thing that's installed automatically. So this would be pre-configured, and if it had different behaviors in different contexts, and you're not really telling people you're in the standard profile after, like, so I could build the site, I step back after building that site, someone else comes in, they may, and it's just, I know you can already change content editor. It just adds it, and it's only happening during build. So this is probably not a major concern, but it's just usually not a good idea to call an apple and an orange both apple. That's just like, if they're different things, then usually you need to call them different things, but it may not matter to anyone who's looking at this from a development perspective.
I'm not sure I follow. Are you kind of saying that, like, are you concerned that content, if we put content moderation as enabled by default and standard, that it would conflict with something like the content editor role?
I'm assuming, based upon what we're just talking about, that we are still doing a separate profile, and that you have content editor in both profiles. So standard has a content editor, which is truncated version of a content editor in the, we'll call it editorial profile. And in the editorial profile, you are automatically going to enable the content moderation and workflow modules. And in standard, you would not. So that's where the delta is. You basically are not including in the same content editor role. And the reason that, to me, is a challenge is, if I then come in after the fact, I'm on the standard profile and I add content moderation, it may be very confusing for some people that they've added content moderation and those additional permissions have to be manually configured. It's just one more thing that isn't automatically happening.
Yeah,
Now,
I see what you mean. Yeah.
if we can automate that, if we can know that the content editor is always there and have a small modification of that role, so when you enable the content moderation module, it adds those permissions, because it can always count on the content editor existing or something along those lines, then that completely resolves the issue. And again, this may not be a big problem for anyone. This may just be in how I've managed larger scale sites. So that's it.
I think that was actually one option that floated in my head, was like, oh well, can we just have in content moderation like a hook install that just adds as permissions to content editor? But then you can't guarantee that the content editor role we're shipping with whatever profile is the same content editor role that happens to be installed in the site. Like there's no way for us to be sure that someone hasn't already customized the content editor role and then they go install content moderation and they don't realize a whole bunch of permissions just got given out to people they didn't want that to be given to. So I don't know if we can, like, I'd be quite nervous about content moderation just enforce, like, effectively shoving its permissions into roles that we can't guarantee those have been untouched. You see what I mean?
Now this is more complex, but what if rather than making it a install hook, you actually made it, for lack of a better term, a button or a choice? And so when you checkbox, it says, do you want to add this to your content editor role? Yes. So it's something that we add a small piece to the content moderation module. What is positive about this is it develops a pattern where any new contrib or core module that wants to add permissions to a given predictable role like content editor, they could actually, that this would be something that you could add to any module that you wanted to. It becomes a predictable pattern. And it allows people to know that they can count on, because we haven't had this before. We haven't had a role like content editor that we could count on. If we are now saying, hey, with certain things, you're going to be able to do this, it gets rid of the need for a non-standard profile. We just have the standard profile. Someone enables the module and then they check the box, please give, or they press the button, please give, and then it actually goes through. And you can also reverse it. It has the ability, please remove these permissions from content editor role. But that's really far off field. I just don't know if that solves the problem.
I think that's an interesting idea. It's kind of like almost like suggestions. When you go to install a module, it makes suggestions as to what you might be sensible defaults, like add these permissions to the content editor role. And maybe there's some other, maybe there's something, maybe this is something worth exploring. Like, should there be a paradigm for modules suggesting particular configuration changes when they install?
Right. That's what that's how I would describe what I'm suggesting.
Mm-hmm.
And what this allows us to do is short term, we actually remove the content moderation pieces from content editor. We add content editor to the standard profile. We open a new issue specifically to this. And then if that gets committed, then that gives us the capacity to add content moderation down the line. But it means that it then becomes manageable even for existing sites, because so long as I have instructions, add a role called content editor with machine name X, I can now manually add the same thing that would have been installed by the standard profile, and we can allow anyone to have access to this paradigm. So it unblocks us, it gives us a long-term path forward, and it gives us something that gives content editor sustainability, so that it isn't something that's one time. It's something that any module could then count on and say, okay, content manager, this is how you would add it to the content manager role. And it allows the community to have predictable but more robust behaviors that are sustainable and updatable, so that if, for instance, a new permission is added with a module, it can say, hey, I want to add that permission to content editor. This is the pattern that I use to achieve that in a predictable way.
So Ofer has joined us. Thank you. We're talking about the content editor role, the issue I'm sharing on the screen, and the problem that it includes content moderation permissions. And for technical reasons, that will work now, but is unlikely to work in Drupal 9.3. And we're discussing how to manage that. So Thomas, that suggestion is sort of orthogonal to what we've been talking about, but I think everyone agrees that the permissions screen is a usability nightmare. And the standard instructions have always been when you enable a new module, whether it's core or contrib, as soon as you enable it, you should configure new permissions for it, which means going to this usability nightmare page. And independent of anything else we talk about today, it would be great to have something more manageable, a permissions for this module page with a link to it as soon as you enable the module. And I think that would be pretty doable.
That sounds awesome. And again, like for me, what's important is I want to unblock this issue so we can get it in. And I'm not against adding additional profiles. Like one of the things I've thought about is we were talking at one point, what do you do if someone is a single site builder and they want to, now this gets into Christina's very valid concerns about bike shedding. But I've always wondered with other applications when I've used them, they have more than just kind of standard, like as the default and minimum, and essentially a demo. Like that's a very limited number of default configurations to come out with. Like if we're adding these permissions and we wanted to make certain that if, like, I don't know why someone would have content moderation in their default configuration, but you need to make certain that they're fully functional. It opens the space for talking about it later. So from a profile perspective, this issue is directly tied to standard as it stands. It wasn't even about adding a new profile. So maybe the first thing is just talking about how do we get this done? And then we spawn any additional issues for an additional profile or the modifications of that I suggested or that you've just suggested, Benji, like whatever approach we want to take. I believe that we can get this in with minimal fuss and then continue to iterate on what we need to do to address the other issues around it. Rather than making the profile directly, a new profile directly part of this particular patch and this particular update. So my suggestion is let's spawn the proper additional issues. Let's reduce the scope of the current patch to remove the contrib pieces or the content moderation pieces so that they're not automatically included, but we document what we've removed, and that goes directly into the newly opened issues for what to address from the content moderation space. Does that make sense on a way to get us forward?
Yes. And I think so. The interesting thing that you bring up with profiles is, for a while I have thought that it would be great if core could provide some persona-based profiles. Like I would, like if I had enough time, I would love to like work on an initiative to add a blog profile to core so that you basically select it and you get almost like a WordPress style thing, right? And we have the stuff in core to do that already. It's just I don't think anybody's ever sort of taken a planned out an initiative like that. Or like maybe standard one day becomes like it's no longer called standard, it becomes like a content authoring kind of profile. So but again, these are more long-term things, and I think that we've had the current profiles, as you said, Thomas, for so long, and maybe Drupal needs to iterate on and evolve that. But I also wonder, like in that line of thinking, like what would stop us from adding content moderation, like enabling content moderation by default, because if in standard, because if standard is meant to be the like that 80% use case, then the 80% use case for Drupal sites is, you know, content, and most of that you probably want at least some level of content moderation. I mean, even if you're running a single site like a blog or something, like content moderation is useful because maybe you want to start writing something in a draft mode, and then maybe eventually you have content that you don't want to delete but you want to archive it. You know, even for a single person site, there's use cases for content moderation, right? So I would be really, I think a follow-up issue to this should be, if it doesn't already exist, like let's get content moderation into standard, and why is it not already in standard?
Related to what you said, I recently saw this personas module. I thought it's very interesting and kind of very related to what you said. Yeah. No.
Yeah. So that's more like to do with suggesting roles and permissions.
Yeah, it looks into how to make it different than how it's done today.
Okay, so to follow up on what Thomas was saying, if we do get the content editor role in the current issue is RTBC, if we get it fixed, then I'm pretty sure that we'll have to modify it before 9.3 is released and remove the content moderation permissions from it. So that will be our way forward. And then we can either discuss adding content moderation to the standard profile, or we can discuss adding a new profile that would have an enhanced content editor role, including the moderation. And as long as I've got it, I've just installed standard, and I'm enabling content moderation and layout builder, neither of which is enabled in standard. And for Thomas's other suggestion, at this point, when I continue, I would probably get a new screen that shows me just the permissions for the modules I'm now enabling, rather than having to go to this horrible, horrible, horrible page.
Agreed.
And find where is content moderation or workflows. Oh, I guess content moderation is an odd beast. It doesn't put its permissions here anyway.
Oh yeah, they kind of
but layout builder does.
Don't they?
Where did layout builder go?
I think this is just proving your point, Ben.
Yeah, it's like oh, that's it to speak to that screen, like if it was you know, like here's a suggested permission configuration. It gave you like a subset of the permission screen that was like had kind of pre-populated checkboxes. Like I'm just basing it on how it looks right now, which may or may not be, you know, the best idea, but you know, just something that's like easily here apply. You can apply and have this suggested permission set. Like, okay, great, cool, done.
I just know that as a new site builder back in the day, these types of things confused the daylights out of me, and I was always struggling to figure out why something didn't function after an install, or why I couldn't do something, or why there were unexpected behaviors. And I think when it comes down to usability, which is ostensibly our raison d'etre, this is a key component because we're talking about permissions in the standard profile. I like the idea of continuing to evolve the standard profile to improve it for the 80% case, and making certain that we listen to when Christina says, hey, this is not on target for that 80% use case, we take that very seriously, and then we can have other conversations about what is the purpose of profiles, what can we do to improve that usability space for new site builders, or for an experienced site builder who has a common thing that they're a common starting point, like a blog, for instance. So I think these are related but separate tracks. And I just want to make certain that we can get this issue in so that we can continue to move forward, because I want us to be able to get towards the manager if we can. Because to me, just the content editor still needs the manager role permission as well to give you the bifurcation of editing versus managing, because I think it's going to take a lot of experience for us to really understand the consequences of what we are doing. So I want to get it out there so that people are using these things sooner rather than later. And that's just my opinion.
And just for the sake of the recording, Tom's is referring to this issue, 3201550, add new content manager role to standard profile, and this will be a follow-up to the content editor role.
And just to build on what you were saying, Thomas, I think like if you're new to Drupal, and it's like arguably, yeah, it's a better experience than it used to be, because we give you the you can install the demo Umami profile, which is great. I don't know if content moderation comes installed in that, like comes enabled by default in that. But even if it doesn't, like if you go to the standard profile and you're like, okay, I want to set up a site for real, and you use the standard profile, and then you go and you're like, oh, I've heard about this content moderation thing. You want to use it, like, okay, weird, it's not already enabled, but all right, you go and enable it, and then you have to like you have to understand where you first of all then have to go figure out how to enable its permissions for people who aren't you, assuming there's more than one user on your site, but you get to a point where you're creating roles and users, and you're like, where's the permissions to give people access to these workflows? Oh, they're under the workflow part of the permission screen, not the content moderation part, which architecturally makes sense, but from a usability perspective, it's just the worst situation to put someone in, because they have no idea where to find these permissions now. They didn't know to go look under W for workflow right at the bottom. They're looking at the top for content moderation and not finding all the permissions they need. So yeah, I think even if as a follow-up, yeah, we get content moderation into standard with some sensible defaults, I think that goes a long way to improving the wider adoption of Drupal as a like from a first from an out of the box perspective.
That's odd. I thought I enabled it.
And you're gonna have to go back and look at the recording to see what.
I think I saw you enabled. Did you enable layout discovery? Because that's the thing, you have to enable layout discovery as well. I definitely saw that on your screen. Yeah, that's weird.
When I click continue rather than cancel, it's supposed to.
Yeah.
Maybe I clicked cancel instead of continue.
It knows you're talking about it.
I'm curious if Christina has some opinions on what we've been talking about.
There we go.
I don't know, it's still just the wide idea will be more or less the same. Just concerned about the efforts that something like that will take. And yeah, especially how some companies that have profiles, installation profiles as a business, the amount of efforts that they put in there. I mean, if as a community, we will be able to do that on a new profile. That's still my main concern, apart from obviously if it would be better experience, which I'm pretty sure it would. It's still just my concern about how feasible is actually get that done. But for the rest of the thing, I probably agree with most of you.
Thank you. And yeah, that's why I like putting the any additional profile discussion into its own vein, because it unblocks getting this done, and then we can figure out if like I agree with Christina's concerns that maintaining a lot of profiles, like companies spend a lot of time doing that already, and there are companies for whom that is even part of their business model. So I don't know what the larger community reaction to it would be. And I think that if we block this from getting into standard, that's just a shame. But I think profiles in many ways, like it's, I feel like gosh, I feel like Drupal is a bit archaic at times in that we aren't responding to a lot of site builders who are just looking for good opinionated starting points. We're like, Drupal's very, very complex, and a lot of the usability research in the past has pointed to the fact that there's a very large barrier to entry. And once you get into using it, people love to use Drupal long term. Like, people like Drupal more and more the longer they stick with it. But there's this big wall to get through. And from my perspective, when we talk about what you start from, so the standard and having an understandable like editorial role, these things are key building blocks for the foundation of how to improve that usability. So
I think
just
just to speak on that, I think, and I don't know how the reaction to this would be, but there's the new project browser initiative. Well, it's not new, but it's recently revived itself, which is I am really hopeful for, because it'll make it really easy to just install modules and themes. But it would be great if that could also work for installing a profile right from the installation screen. And there's some fantastic community-driven and organization-driven profiles for those different personas out there. I know Acquia has one for content authoring. I know there's because there's like lightning and thunder, and I can't remember who's who or which one is which. But there's I know like the Australian government have done one specifically for like government, like that they contribute. There's a lot of really great, there's the commerce one, for instance, from Centauro. There's a lot of great starting points out there, but I think it's about Drupal being honest, core being honest and saying, okay, we should just present these to people up front as options, because you were saying as really good solid starting points, because what we can do in core is not going to be as good ultimately as what some of these profiles can deliver out of the box. Like, if you consider commerce, for instance, Drupal core does not provide any commerce facilities, but the Drupal commerce, that's ecosystem of modules, is fantastic, and Centaur done a great job on that, and their starter kit profile that they provide is really really well done. So I think there's an argument there to be made about just so Christina saying she has to let's see what's another call. But yeah, I think there's an argument there to say the project browsers should be up in front when it comes to profiles as well, and giving you those options.
Okay, and as you were talking about profiles, I was browsing to Drupal.org and list of profiles hosted there. It seems there's only one that's marked as working with Drupal 9. That seems like a problem. Maybe most or all of the Drupal 8 profiles actually work with Drupal 9 as well.
Yeah.
172 match. Thunder is the publishing distribution that is, I forget who supports it, but it's not Acquia. Lightning is Acquia's starting
Oh.
point for all of their professional services projects.
Okay, so Thunder's the one. It's a large news media organization that built it. I think in Germany. I think it was a German or Austrian or something. Some European, like massive media conglomerate that has huge amount of resources to maintain this profile and do an excellent job because they have a vested interest in it. And a lot of publishing sites would, you can see a screenshot there. That looks like a pretty good interface in some ways. Like if we can surface these when you go to install, if you're a new user and you to think of the out-of-box experience, and the fact that when you go to install Drupal, if the project browser initiative could then surface profiles in some way to people to install right there, then that would be a huge win, I think.
I absolutely. I'm sorry.
No, it's because it feels quite off topic, but I like this discussion.
For me, I just want to tie back this discussion to the fact that that's why I want us to get this particular issue in, because this is kind of foundational for all these other discussions. Like authenticated was never a great role to have from a permission standpoint. Like it doesn't speak to the purpose of the site or why a site builder would segment personas or roles or whatever paradigm we want to use within Drupal. And it makes things really challenging because it encourages a Wild West behavior in terms of everybody builds, you want to build out something that can be predicted in contrib space so that when someone wants to contribute a new module, they know they can count on the content editor being there. Because then you have a working paradigm for how you want people, you can suggest it, we can fix it the way that Benji was suggesting. Like there's a lot of different things that we can fix in the future that are heavy lifts. But you can't even start thinking about that. You can't even start documentation if we don't have this base role. So I would do anything it takes, including Benji, let's editing the patch when we need to and removing the content moderation. We can add them back in the future to the same exact place if need be, if that issue gets pulled. But whatever it takes to get this in there, it's really important for us to be able to have these other conversations. It's like these other conversations really shouldn't start until we know what the starting point is.
Okay, so it's getting close to the hour. Let's wrap up the discussion. So there are a bunch of ideas that need follow-up. So I guess we will continue. We've already marked at RTVC. We'll continue trying to get the roles into standard. And yeah, as Thomas just pointed out, that's important to have them there as an expectation. The idea about improving the permissions configuration when enabling a new module. Thomas, would you like to open an issue for that?
Sure. What queue should I open that issue in?
Let me think.
Would that be ideas queue? It's still kind of we're still kind of trying to figure out what exactly. I mean, we brainstormed a couple of ideas there, but we don't really have a firm. I don't think we have a firm idea yet. So maybe the ideas queue is a good place to start the discussion.
Yeah, you're right. I was thinking of jumping right into implementation, but we have to think about a little bit of design, what the pages are going to look at, what the user experience is going to be. So yeah, I think you're right. Ideas queue seems right.
Okay, so I want to do a permissions issue for when contrib
Any module is enabled.
When
Yeah. I think we're basically saying like a way for a module to provide sensible suggestions, like sensible defaults, or suggest permissions to enable. I guess, is that right? Sounds about right.
Let's just call it improving the user experience when configuring permissions for a newly enabled module. And I think the first step is just to snip out the portion of the permissions page that relates to the module or modules you've just enabled. And a second step would be to somehow provide suggestions.
Yeah, I think if we need a use case for this, the content moderation one is a great example, because you've got you basically enable it, go to permissions, you look at content moderation, then at some point down the line you realize, oh, there's some permissions somewhere else, and what you don't realize is they're all the way at the bottom of the list under workflows. Presumably they're under workflow.
And the recommendations in my mind would key off of predictable users. So recommendations, for instance, let's say you don't have content editor role enabled, it could give you a message, the content editor role doesn't exist, you may want to create it, otherwise you don't get a recommendation, something along those lines. Or it has a fallback, but there, we can talk about that. It's all going to be in the ideas. Okay, and I'm not the world's like best issue communicator, but I'm going to open this up and we can modify it as a team as people have responses on how to improve the idea. I can update the overall issue.
Absolutely.
Yep.
And I think we'll also want to continue the discussion about whether content moderation should be added to the standard profile. And I think it's still an open question whether it's worth adding a new profile to core. Although, as Christina points out, that's a significant maintenance burden. Anything else to wrap up?
There was a last thing that Aaron suggested us. So should we add one or more new profiles? And the last one was a discussion. I think, do you want to open that one, Aaron? The discussion you were mentioning about like improving how we interact with profiles straight from the get-go?
Yeah, you know what? I think this is something that because the project browser initiative is just ramping up, it's probably something for their roadmap. So I think I'm going to try and go along to the meeting they're having on Monday. So I might try and mention it there.
Yep.
Or mention it in the thread and see what comes up. But otherwise, yeah, I can open an issue specifically on that.
Okay,
but it'd
cool.
be interesting to get a wider sort of initiative.
Agreed. Okay. I think that's everything, Benji.
Okay. And we're just at the hour, so thank you again. And hope to see you again next week.
Thanks, Benji.
Thanks
Thanks everyone.